All right, so this is the Now What videocast. This is all about the foundings of government. And the first thing we're going to talk about is first attempt. Dud. Now, the Continental Congress after the war invites states to write their own constitution. So the Continental Congress invites states to actually say what they want. And these constitutions had similarities. First off, they said no to executive power because the royal governors were terrible, terrible people, and they don't want other executives. They kept colonial traditions like the bicameral legislature. They expanded on common rights, woohoo, and most guaranteed religious freedom, which was an interesting concept going forward. So those couple of things is they got rid of the executive power, did not want executive power because of the terrible royal governors. They kept colonial traditions like bicameral legislatures. They expanded common rights, woohoo, and most guaranteed religious freedom, which was an interesting concept going forward. Now, in 1777, the Continental Congress decides, well, we kind of need a plan to stick together. And so they draft a loose confederation of states called the Articles of Confederation. It stunk. It was terrible. So 1777, the Continental Congress drafts their loose confederation of states, the stinky Articles of Confederation. And here is a video that tells you about it. And you can actually read it right here. Now, the Articles of Confederation only created a one-house, one-vote legislature, which basically means they could do jack diddly squat other than a few foreign policy issues and a few wars. So the one-house, one-vote legislature created in the Articles of Confederation basically could do jack diddly squat. So after the revolution, relationships with foreign countries were not good either. They thought America was stupid. And so things like out of fear, the Spanish would cut off trade with New Orleans because they thought, well, if we keep letting them trade, they're going to want to come out here. I'm going to pull that down. The British, they would only trade with America under conditions that made them the boss, that made them great. And the British even kept forces to the west that they promised they would get out. So the Spanish wouldn't let the colonies trade with New Orleans. The British wouldn't trade except under conditions that actually benefited, and there's still British troops to the west of the colonies. Sorry. Pictures are messed up. Now, the Articles of Confederation had several problems. First off, the government could not establish a currency. So you actually had states that had their own currency. Every state had their own currency. Think about how that was easy to trade. The federal government could also not regulate trade. So states actually regulated trade between each other and imposed laws that hurt each other. The federal government could also not levy taxes, so they were basically broke. They had to depend on unrealistic loans from the states that the states weren't going to give them. And then the last problem with the Articles is every state actually has to agree to change this. That's why you end up with a constitution, because they just say, let's start over. So the problems with the Articles, the federal government could not establish a currency. They could not regulate trade. They could not levy taxes. They actually had to depend on loans from the states that the states weren't going to give them. And every single one of them had to agree to change the Articles. Basically, they had no money and no real power. Now, the slowdown in trade also meant increased unemployment and reduced prices, which, guess what? Just like in today's world, meant farmers went into debt with their suppliers, and those were British suppliers. So the problems with trade meant that farmers go into debt, especially with British suppliers. So in 1785, suppliers start demanding their money, and farmers lacked the proper things to pay that. So they began losing their property. So in 1785, suppliers actually start to demand their money. Farmers lack the paper to actually do that, and so they start losing property. And of course, with all this happening, in 1787, a Massachusetts farmer named Daniel Shea is going to rebel against the foreclosures. And it signals that more government is needed, that there needs to be a change. So in 1787, Daniel Shea rebels, and it signals there needs to be a change. And here's more on Daniel Shea. And even more on Daniel Shea. All right, so this is It's Gov time, and this is all about the Constitutional Convention. So by 1787, most Americans wanted to change the cruddy Articles and give Congress the power to tax and the power to regulate trade. So there's the Articles. The Constitutional Convention opens on May 25th, 1787, with several characteristics. Meetings were held in secret so the delegates could speak without worrying what others thought. And it included all the big-time people in the colonies, except John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were diplomats overseas. And many of the delegates, they had government experience. A lot of them had signed the Declaration of Independence. And here is some more on the Constitutional Convention. Now, they came to the Constitutional Convention to amend the Articles of Confederation, but they soon said, you know what, it's time for a new plan. It's time for a new plan of government. The first plan, the Virginia Plan, was proposed by James Madison. It gave the government the power to tax and the power to regulate trade. And it had a bicameral legislature, but representation was only based on population. There was not a house that was equal. So they gave the Virginia Plan gave the power to tax and trade. It was a bicameral legislature with both houses representation based on population. And they had one executive with a 7-year term. And here's some more about the Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan stinks to the small states because the legislature is based on population. So really, they would have no say. So the small states come up with the New Jersey Plan. And the New Jersey Plan was only intended to be modest changes to the Articles of Confederation. It was what was favored by the small states. Of course, it gave the government the power to tax and the power to regulate trade. And it called for a executive committee rather than one executive. And the whole thing with the New Jersey Plan is the legislature was based on every state being equal instead of being based on population. And if you want to know more, here's the New Jersey Plan. So obviously there's got to be a compromise here, and it's called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And it gave the government the power to tax and trade, and that pretty much everybody thought that was something that they had to have. And it was a compromise between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan about representation in the legislature. It was a bicameral legislature where you had one house that was equal, that's today's U.S. Senate, and you had one house that was by population, and that's today's House of Representatives. And they had one executive. This is the plan we have today. It's called the Connecticut Compromise. If you want to know more, here you go. And if you actually want to read the Constitution, the words of the Constitution, there you go again. Now, states did not just want to give up the juice they had. So they compromised on state power by dividing government power between the federal government and the state government in the Constitution. This is called federalism. So the term of dividing power between the federal government and the state government is called federalism. Basically, states had the powers that weren't listed in the Constitution. The federal government only had the power of what was listed in the Constitution. And here's more about federalism in the United States. Now, when they decided to use population counts in the legislature, the South wants to have an equal say. And so they got to figure out how to do that. And they go, well, we got all these slaves. How do we count them as part of the population? So the compromise was called the Three-Fifths Compromise. And basically it means a slave counts as 3/5 of a person in the population counts. But that number also counts in the taxes due to the federal government. So like you have a certain amount of tax due for every person in your population of a state. And that number, that 3/5, also counts to that tax as due. And here's more about the Three-Fifths Compromise. And if you want to know more, here you go. Now, the Bill of Rights was originally omitted because if you add a Bill of Rights, how does that apply to slavery? So the Bill of Rights was originally omitted from the Constitution. And if you want to know more about the Bill of Rights and actually read the Bill of Rights, there you go. All right, so this part has come together, and this is all about the ratification of the Constitution. All right, so one of the problems of the Articles of Confederation is that every state had to agree to change it. They fixed the problem of the Articles by saying only 9 states had to ratify the Constitution instead of every single one of them suckers. So they fix it by saying only 9 states had to ratify. They were worried state legislatures would cause problems because of their loss of power here, because they are losing some power. So one of the ways that they decide to ratify the Constitution is to have special ratification conventions. They don't want to give it to the state legislatures because they feared they wouldn't agree, so they have special ratification conventions. Now with the Constitution, 2 groups emerge here. You have the Federalists who favored ratification and they favor the federal government. They are Federalists. They favor a federal government. And you have the Anti-Federalists who opposed ratification and they're anti-federal government. So they're Anti-Federalists. Now to encourage ratification here, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay write a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, which will be your college fun. So to encourage ratification, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay wrote a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, which you'll do in college, and they're a lot of fun to read. Not. And here tells you more about the Federalist. And if you actually want to start reading some of the Federalist Papers, there you go. Now, there's certain beliefs in the Federalist Papers. First, they call for a republic. They call for a large federal republic to guard against factions. They want to make sure they want to try and guard against political parties. Madison also said checks and balances could protect individual liberty, and the Federalist Papers also defend the executive. So some of the beliefs in the Federalist Papers: they call for a republic, they call for this large federal republic to guard against factions, which are like political parties. Madison said checks and balances could protect individual liberty, and they also want to defend the executive. And here you can read one of the most well-known Federalist Papers, Federalist 10, written by James Madison, which is all about factions. Now, the Federalists are going to gain support for ratification because of a couple of reasons. One, the two big timers of the colonies, George Washington and Ben Franklin, support the Federalists. So the Federalists gain support because the 2 big timers, Washington and Franklin, actually support the Federalists. Another reason is frontier farmers thought that the federal government could actually deal with their problems on the frontier. If there was a federal government, they can deal with the natives and the British that are on the Great Lakes. Another thing is that urban merchants thought a strong central government would expand business. A lot of the problems they were having going back and forth between states, a federal government ends that. And frankly, the Federalists, they were just better organized than the Anti-Federalists. So exploiting their advantages, the Federalists get quick ratification in Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. So they get quick ratification in Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. So that's 5 different states. Massachusetts promised that they would pass this if there was a Bill of Rights. And so with that promise, they soon get ratification from Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. So that makes 9. So they get, with the promise of a passing of a Bill of Rights, they get ratification from Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire. That makes 9. And here's a video on the Bill of Rights. So that makes 9 states, but really you have to have the 2 biggest for this to be effective. You have to have Virginia and New York, and they get ratification from them in the summer of 1788. So really, for the Constitution to be effective, you have to have ratification from the 2 biggest states, Virginia and New York. And the new Congress gets that from them in the summer of 1888. So the new Congress gets going on March 4th, 1789 in New York City. And the Bill of Rights is passed in 1789. It's written mostly by James Madison. New Congress gets going on March 4th, 1789. They pass the Bill of Rights, written mostly by Madison. And if you want to know more about Madison, there. All right, so this is Let's Get It Started. This is all about the new government in the United States. Now, when this new government starts off, it's got some big-time problems. The first is the government's in debt. Second, they have a small army and no navy. And the third, they're not respected by other countries. So the first problem is they have some big-time debt, they have a small army and no navy, and then they're not respected by other countries. So in 1789, the country elects Washington as the first president and John Adams as the vice president. So Washington's the president, Adams the vice president. If you want to know more about George Washington, There you go. There you go again. So another issue the country's having is that the Brits actually continued to have forts in the Great Lakes area. And they're actually giving guns to natives so the colonists wouldn't come out there. So the Brits were giving guns to natives so the colonists wouldn't come out to the Great Lakes. Now, as Washington starts office, he starts setting precedents almost immediately. The first precedent is the judiciary precedent. The Constitution really only creates a Supreme Court. The rest of the judiciary was created by the Judiciary Act of 1789. So Washington is really the one who creates the rest of the federal judiciary. Washington also was the first to form a cabinet, and it's formed out of the heads of federal government departments by Washington, obviously a big part of the presidency today. So Washington is the first to form a cabinet, and that was formed out of the federal government department heads. And if you want to know more about the Judiciary Act, oops, we went back. Now, if you want to know more about the Judiciary Act, there you go. Now, the first Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton, and he became a target for the Anti-Federalists. So Alex Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury, and he was a target for the Anti-Federalists. Hamilton wanted to fix the country's problems by helping to industrialize the nation, issuing bonds to pay the debts, and chartering the Bank of the United States. So Hamilton wanted to fix the government's problems by industrializing, issuing bonds to pay debts, and chartering the Bank of the United States. Now, to implement Hamilton's plan, it required a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which there were many who didn't want that. So to implement Hamilton's plan, it required a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And if you want to know more about Alex Hamilton, pretty neat guy, there you go. And really, the way they get Hamilton's plan passed is Washington and Hamilton agreed to move the capital to Washington, D.C. It had been in Philadelphia. So they actually agreed to move the capital to Washington, D.C. in order to get Hamilton's plan passed. And here's some more about Washington, D.C. Now, part of the plan to pay the debt was to actually tax whiskey. So part of the plan to pay the debt was to tax whiskey. Farmers in Pennsylvania who were making whiskey didn't really like that, and so they rebelled. And Washington and Hamilton quickly put down this rebellion. So part of the plan to pay the debt was to tax whiskey. Farmers in Pennsylvania didn't really like that, and so they rebel, and it's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And if you want to know more about the Whiskey Rebellion, there you go. Now, in 1793, the Brits and the French go to war again. Remember, they hate each other many, many times. So in 1793, they go to war again. The U.S. declares neutrality, and the colonists actually became angry as the British start seizing ships in the West Indies. So in 1793, the Brits and the French actually go to war again. The U.S. declares their neutrality, but the people of America become angry because the British are seizing ships in the West Indies. So in 1794, the U.S. signs the Jay Treaty to avoid war with the British. 1794, Jay Treaty to avoid war with the British. It actually eliminates the British forts in the West, but it keeps U.S. shipping restrictions. So in 1798, the U.S. signs the Pinckney Treaty, which opens up trade with Spain. So they signed the Jay Treaty in 1794 to eliminate forts in the West and to keep them out of a war with the British. 1795, the Pinckney Treaty, which opens up trade with Spain. If you want to know more about the Jay Treaty, there you go. You can actually read the Jay Treaty. Whoa! All right, so the removal of British forts, victories over Indians, and trade with New Orleans encouraged settlers to move west. So the removal of the British forts in the West, the victories over the natives, and trade with New Orleans encouraged settlers to move west. Now, Washington left office in 1796, which sets a precedent of 2 terms, and it showed that Washington would not be a monarch. When he came to power, there was a lot of worry that he would turn into a king. By him leaving after 2 terms, he sets that precedent. There is no rule up to FDR, but he sets that precedent. Now, John Adams defeats Thomas Jefferson in 1796, and because of the rules at the time, Jefferson, who came in second, was the vice president. So John Adams wins the presidential election of 1796, Jefferson's the VP. Here's more on good old John Adams. Very interesting character. And even more on John Adams. Now, after the U.S. signs the Jay Treaty, of course, the British mortal enemy, the French, so the British mortal enemy, the French, became offended, so they start seizing U.S. ships. So after the Jay Treaty signed, the French become offended, and they start seizing U.S. ships. The U.S. tries to negotiate, but they were offered humiliating terms in what's called the XYZ affair. So the U.S. tried to negotiate with the French, but they were offered crappy terms in what's called the XYZ affair. And here's some more about the XYZ affair. Now, in 1798, Congress agrees to expand the Army and the Navy with unpopular taxes after the failure to negotiate with the French. They thought there might be a war with the French. So in 1798, Congress agrees to expand the Army and the Navy with unpopular taxes after their failure to negotiate with the French. Also in 1798, Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Act. They wanted to end the discontent in the colonies, or in the states. So in 1798, Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Act, and it was an attempt to end the discontent in the country. Basically, the act allows the government to deport any immigrant who criticizes the government. This is kind of against the Constitution. So 1798 Alien and Sedition Act allows the government to deport any immigrant who criticizes the Constitution. And to know more about the Alien and Sedition Acts, there you go. And wait, there's more. You can actually read it. Now, the act was met with serious opposition. Kentucky and Virginia actually declared this act unconstitutional. So the act was met with serious opposition, and Kentucky and Virginia, they actually declare this act unconstitutional. So sensing the anger, Adams sends new delegates to France and suspends the Army's expansion. But really the damage is done here. People hate John Adams. And Jefferson's going to win the election of 1800. And it signals the first transfer of power between parties. So with all these problems, people hate John Adams. Jefferson wins the election of 1800, and it signals the end, or the first time power transfers between political parties. And if you want to know more about the election of 1800, there you go. But wait, there's more.